Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. The divide is growing over Kinder Morgan's $7.4 billion expansion of its Trans Mountain oil pipeline, which runs from the Alberta oil sands to export facilities on the south coast of BC. Alberta's NDP-led government is now threatening to cut off BC's gasoline supply if BC's NDP-led government doesn't back down on its strategy to strangle the project with reams of new red tape. Beyond the obvious schadenfreude that comes from watching the NDP tearing at each other's throats, Canadians should be keenly worried about the outcome of this debate. Last week, RegWatch attended a pro-pipeline rally in Vancouver and spoke with key proponents of the Trans Mountain expansion project. And here is some of what they had to say.
So we are here to work with British Columbians, with the First Nations. We are here to address any environmental concerns.
It's become too easy in BC to delay projects to death. For too long, the loudest side of the story has come from the Greenies, and I know you know who I'm talking about. The Greenies have been willing to do almost anything to get attention. The Greenies want people to believe that no one in BC wants projects like the pipeline expansion to happen. Well, that's just not true.
Time and again, Canadian First Nations, and I hear this in the documentaries I'm making right now across Western and Northern Canada, Canadian First Nations have had big promises from the forces of no. Time and again, once those groups have finished shutting down an opportunity, off they go, off to stop the next Canadian opportunity somewhere else. No jobs left behind, nothing. And that's why so many of the chiefs that I'm talking to these days are mad.
Why are you here today? Why is this important to your riding?
Well, because originally I supported LNG for the jobs and the revenues that could support my people back in Haisla. Now I'm here because I see BC needs an advocate for all resource industries like mining, forestry, LNG, Kinder Morgan, you name it, because they're all under attack.
You're First Nations.
And I'm First Nations. I was actually chief councillor from 2009 to 2017, but I resigned from that position to run as MLA because I thought economic development needed some support from a person like me.
Is it unusual for First Nations to be supporting projects like this?
It is in public. It's very unusual, but a lot of First Nations of BC support economic development and resource development. But it's just not safe to do so nowadays in public.
How do you mean that?
Well, there's a lot of lateral violence toward any First Nations leader that really, or anybody for that matter, First Nations or not. But for First Nations, the problem is fairly drastic, because if you support it in public, there's a good chance your vehicle will get keyed, your tires will get slashed, or in some cases, vehicles can get burned. So it's actually not a very good position to be in when you're saying that you support resource development as a First Nations leader. Why
are so many in First Nations so vehemently opposed, or are they captured by activists?
You know, I think a lot of First Nations are stuck in between supporting and non-supporting. But everybody I've talked to supports the idea of getting a job to support their families. They're just not ready to basically go out in public and say it.
What about the regulators? They've done their job, haven't they?
You know, for the last 13 years, I participated in environmental assessments at the federal level and provincial level. And I had my criticisms, but one of my criticisms was not the idea that it wasn't fulsome or it wasn't adequate. I really felt that the environmental assessments, if anything, costed companies way too much money and costed First Nations way too much money in terms of engagement. So the idea that the regulators, that we have to revamp the environmental assessment, that can only mean in my mind that we want to make it more difficult to achieve a certificate and thusly make it more expensive.
So bottom line, what's your message to Canadians?
You know, if you truly support resource development, if you really truly support more services like hospitals and teachers and doctors and nurses, then you've got to speak up.
Why should people in the rest of the country care about Kinder Morgan pipeline?
Yeah, because crude oil is what pays the rent for Canada. I know a lot of people think that automobiles and auto parts are a big part of that. They are a big export, but nothing creates a trade surplus like crude oil does. And that's why one of the economists we deal with likes to say that crude oil pays the rent. In the last 3 years, it generated $140 billion in excess money that we had to fund our social programs, to defend our country, our borders, to provide all of the social services that people expect, to let us get the food, the iPhones, the orange juice, the things we don't build or make ourselves.
Now, this battle has been going on for a long time in British Columbia, but now Alberta's involved and there's a bit of a war. You know, what's that all about?
It's time to bring these provinces back together. Alberta and British Columbia are too important in confederation. They're old friends that really should be best friends right now. There's difference over this one issue. A lot of people here who've traveled out from Alberta to be here in downtown Vancouver, a lot of people who've come from around Vancouver to be here are seeing the heartbreaking division between two great provinces. We want to bring them back together, have a unified vision on how we safely get this valuable pay-the-rent commodity to market so all Canadians can benefit.
Now, the regulators have approved this project. The federal government has approved it. So why is it not going ahead?
Well, there seems to be a degree of hesitation amongst some people in government, particularly in British Columbia. They have some activists now in government positions who are trying to stall the project, it seems, until the project's backers just pack up and go away. Stall, stall, stall. It's a familiar tactic in environmental activism, and we're seeing it here. And so it's led Alberta to vent its frustration. The Premier of Alberta has come out here before to talk in Vancouver about why she thinks it's a project that benefits all of Canada and why we all need it. I think environmentalists have the frustration, and I sort of sympathize with it, that the only way to get people's attention is to do something to scare them. And that's here evidenced in the fear that's totally baseless that there's going to be some catastrophic oil spill because of tankers taking additional, because we already ship crude oil by tanker out of Vancouver.
You mentioned when you're talking to First Nations that they're let down by the activist movements as they come in and then leave after they get a no. Could you explain that?
Yeah, well, I think what I've heard from First Nations, and I recently interviewed a group of I think 9 or 10 different First Nations leaders here in Vancouver, and the recurrent theme that came up and again was, look, we have these environmental protest groups. They come to our communities in remote parts of Canada. They settled in to help us oppose a project, or at least create the appearance that First Nations group is opposing the project, and maybe they're successful at it and that LNG proposal or pipeline goes away. Well, the next day, the environmentalists have gone away too. So the promise that existed from the infrastructure investment of having some jobs and long-term benefits, that's vanished. And the environmentalists have nothing they've left behind either, except they've moved on to stop the next thing that's in their target.
Or will they leave behind resentment and disappointment?
That's what's happened. It's corrosive to Canada.